Good morning, everyone, and thanks for coming to this talk this early in the morning. Thanks to Matt and Emily again for helping to organize, and Eric, who's not here to help organize the session. So I want to talk a little bit today about permafrost and the relationship between permafrost and wildfire, and how these two relationships impact each other in the context of changing climate. And I want to thank, first off, my many co-authors who have helped with this work, and their various institutions. So just to start off with some motivation for why we're interested in permafrost and why geodesists such as yourselves who maybe don't think about permafrost as much might be interested. So permafrost currently contains more than twice the amount of carbon currently in the atmosphere bound within permafrost itself. And as climate changes and permafrost thaw is expected to increase throughout the 21st century, this carbon reserve can become mobilized and potentially enter the atmosphere. So this is a large source of carbon that is potentially in a very sensitive position. As I alluded to, permafrost thaw and also wildfire burn are significant contributors to the introduction of CO2 and methane into the atmosphere. And as the 21st century progresses, wildfire frequency and severity in permafrost regions is expected to increase. So understanding the relationship between wildfire and its effect on both permafrost and permafrost thaw is very important. And finally, traditional methods of measuring permafrost and wildfire severity on permafrost are both costly and time intensive. These are usually in situ measurements that usually take a lot of measuring of point samples and walking around in the tundra. So if you can use remote sensing techniques instead of these traditional methods, you'll save both a lot in money and you'll have a better spatial coverage. So just a quick kind of background on permafrost for those who aren't too familiar with it. So permafrost is perennially frozen ground that has been frozen for more than 2 consecutive years. Approximately 24% of the Earth's surface is underlain by permafrost, and most of this permafrost is in the Arctic in Russia and North America. So just kind of the first order effect on permafrost distribution is a latitudinal gradient. In the northernmost coldest regions, you have what's called continuous permafrost, where you have continuous extents of frozen ice, in many cases several kilometers deep. And as you move southward, you start to go into the discontinuous permafrost regime, where due to warmer temperature, warmer air temperatures, and more complex water geology at the surface, you start to lose this spatial continuity of permafrost, and you start entering sporadic areas of frozen ground, unfrozen ground, which is referred to as italic, and you can have more complex permafrost systems, which can be further modulated by complex surface hydrology. And then over all of this, we have this dotted line here, which is the active layer. So the active layer is the topmost part of the permafrost table that seasonally freezes and thaws due to forcing from warm air temperatures. And you can think of this as the component of the permafrost system that is in communication, so to speak, with the climate and with the atmosphere. This is the part of the permafrost system that can release CO2 and methane due to the freezing and the thawing of the of the permafrost in the active layer. And so understanding this active layer and how thick it is kind of gives you a first order understanding of how much the permafrost system is being forced by the climate. So this active layer is kind of the key variable that we'll be looking at for most of this talk. As I just kind of alluded to, the active layer is a crucial bellwether for permafrost status. Traditional methods of measuring it are basically taking a large metal probe, sticking it into the ground until the point of refusal where you contact the impermeable permafrost table, and then measuring that thickness, which gives you a first order understanding of how much the permafrost is freezing and thawing seasonally. So kind of the first point of this talk will be to address ways that we can measure this active layer using InSAR. The second point of this talk will be addressing this point that I alluded to, that wildfire is a significant modifier of the Arctic landscape. However, this relationship isn't precisely understood. And so one thing we want to hope to do with InSAR is better understand and constrain the effect of wildfire on the permafrost system. Just a brief bit of background for InSAR, which probably most in this room are familiar with, but InSAR is a radar remote sensing technique which can measure surface deformation. It makes it a very attractive candidate for permafrost environments because it can measure both the elastic seasonal freezing and thawing of the permafrost system, as well as any long-term permanent deformation associated with irretrievable permafrost thaw, mass wasting events, etc. And finally, the fine spatial coverage and broad spatial, the fine spatial resolution and broad spatial coverage of InSAR, as well as the increasingly more frequent revisit cycles of newer missions, make it a great technique for long-term monitoring of permafrost systems, which is ultimately one of the goals. So to kind of look at InSAR as a test case, we come to this study site in the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta in southwest Alaska, outlined here in red. This is a river delta that's approximately the size of the state of Louisiana. So it's a massive river delta where the Yukon River empties into the Pacific Ocean. And this lies within the discontinuous permafrost zone. So if you remember that cartoon I showed previously, this is an area where you don't have continuous permafrost. You have frozen ground next to unfrozen ground, and you have a complex interplay between surface hydrology and the permafrost system itself. And what makes this particular study site so interesting is that it has experienced a number of wildfires over the last 40 years. And outlined in this map here in orange are the fire scars of the various wildfires from the last 40 or so years, as well as the year of the fire next to them. And then in blue are just mapped the study sites where we basically made our measurements from. So these are sites where we moved out from and measured permafrost that was both in the burned and the unburned regions in this study site. So just to kind of rehash what the goals of this research talk are, the first one is to see if we can characterize active layer thickness over the study site with InSAR. And then we want to validate that with field GPR and field measurements. And again, the reason we're interested in the active layer thickness itself is that this kind of gives you a first order understanding of the permafrost system, and long-term monitoring of active layer and how it changes over time can shed insight into how permafrost systems change over time with climate or other forcings. Secondly, we want to see if we can determine the long-term deformation rate of permafrost areas that have been burned by wildfire to see if we can characterize a relationship between wildfire forcings on the long-term dynamics of active layer. And finally, if we can do that, we want to see if we can approximate a proxy permafrost recovery function, which I will talk about later. So a bit of background now of how we're going to relate InSAR to active layer thickness. What we do is we assume a simple deformation model that was originally expanded upon by Lin Liu et al. And others in 2012. And so this simple model takes a soil column here, where blue is your frozen permafrost, green is an organic layer. This is basically the topmost vegetation layer of the permafrost system. And then this blue layer here is your permafrost table, below which you have perennially frozen ground. So at the onset of thaw in spring, when air temperatures are above 0, you begin to have thawing of the active layer itself. And so an incremental thawing of the ground will correspond to an incremental subsidence of the surface. So this incremental thawing dH has a corresponding d delta subsidence, which we can relate to each other basically using the density of water ice and liquid ice and the porosity and the saturation fraction of the soil column, assuming various simplifying assumptions basically about the distribution of water in the soil column. Over the entire thaw season, what we can do, in a sense, is measure this total seasonal subsidence of the ground, infer this seasonal subsidence. Measure this total seasonal subsidence over an entire thaw season, and you can integrate over this entire deformation signature, in a sense, to solve for the total amount of thawed active layer here. So we take this equation, we integrate over the active layer thickness, and relate that to the deformation, and we can basically solve the inverse of this problem. Finally, what we can then do is we can relate this seasonal deformation D as we refer to this as our seasonal deformation source. This is as the ground freezes and thaws and subsides. And we basically scale this by the normalized accumulated degree days of thaw, which is essentially related to the thermal diffusion of the thawing front downward as thaw progresses. And we can add to the seasonal deformation term a linear term that depends solely on the difference in time between two InSAR scene acquisitions. We can use this to relate long-term deformation signatures that aren't related to seasonal dynamics. And then finally, we also include a term that's baseline dependent to account for DEM errors and to account for the fact that in this particular study, we're using ALOS pulsar scenes, which the spatial baseline and the temporal baselines are correlated so that we don't alias temporal baseline signatures into the long-term trend. We have to account for this spatial baseline term. So this is kind of the deformation model that we use in this study site. And what we can then do is essentially a modified SBAS routine where we take this equation, we form a stack of interferograms, and then we invert for these deformation parameters here. R, which is the long-term deformation signature, D, which is the seasonal deformation signature, and then epsilon, which is the topography term. So now kind of to talk about the simple wildfire model that we assume for this talk. And in this case, this will refer to the long-term deformation signature that we're talking about, R, in this case. What we're interested in now is seeing if we can model the long-term effect of wildfire on the active layer system. So if we start with a simple soil column of permafrost here, and we induce a wildfire on that column, what's going to happen is it's going to burn off some fraction of the organic layer, some fraction of the vegetation on the topmost surface. And this removal of a portion of the organic layer, as well as the change in the surface albedo of the surface, will essentially perturb the system from its state of thermal equilibrium. And this perturbation from thermal equilibrium will result in a gradual increase in seasonal thaw depth. And over time, what will happen is, all things else being equal climactically, your thaw depth will increase gradually because you no longer have this thermally insulative organic layer at the top of the permafrost system. Slowly, eventually the soil column will reach its point of maximum thaw depth, and you'll eventually have a recovery phase where, and these two things aren't causal, so they're both happening simultaneously, but you'll have increasing thaw depth, and at the same time you'll have ecological succession as vegetation moves in and recolonizes the burned area and gradually builds up this organic layer. And so what will happen is eventually you'll reach a stability point where you reach your maximum thaw depth, and then what will happen is vegetation succession will continue, your organic layer will continue to build up, and you'll have a recovery phase where gradually the seasonal thaw depth will decrease with time until at some future point in time, you will either return to the original thermal equilibrium that your system started at, or you'll reach a new thermal equilibrium. And so what we really want to understand using this simple model of wildfire recovery is the time scale over which this process takes place. We have a decently good understanding of the model, and this is backed up by field observations and ecological observations, but the time frame over which this process takes place is poorly understood. And so that's what we want to see if we can answer and address with InSAR. So if we basically solve this, this deformation problem that I alluded to previously over our study site, in this case we've used a stack of 15 ALOS pulsar scenes collected from 2007 to 2011, and we've done the SBAS inversion, and plotted here is the InSAR-derived active layer thickness. So what this refers to is we've taken the seasonal deformation signature, D, in our equation, and then we've done a simple forward model where we relate that seasonal deformation to the active layer itself based on assumptions about the soil column properties, saturation, vegetation, organic layer thickness, and such. And so what you see is the active layer thickness estimated using InSAR is well, it's hard to see at this scale, but it's well correlated with surface geomorphology, which makes sense. We have very good agreement between, so this region is dotted with a kind of network of peat plateaus where basically you have mounds of permafrost crisscrossed by drainage networks and valleys, essentially, of water drainage. And you have very good agreement between this mapped surface geomorphology and the derived active layer thickness. And then plotted at the bottom here are just uncertainties of the InSAR derived active layer thickness. So these are just the residuals from our SBAS inversion. So what we want to do now, though, is so we have this estimate of active layer thickness. We want to see if it's accurate. So what we can do is we can reference this with field-derived ground-penetrating radar measurements of the active layer thickness, as well as probing measurements. And so plotted here in white is just one GPR transect over a study site. And then plotted here is the subset of points in that transect where we have statistically identical agreement between InSAR and GPR observations. And what I mean by that is we did a chi-squared statistic to compare the two observations. And when both observations lie within the uncertainty value of the other observation, we consider that a statistically identical result. And so what you see is these two techniques agree for a good portion of the scene, and they're both capturing feature-specific heterogeneity in active layer thickness. Specifically, you'll notice that the active layer in this case increases as you move closer to this thaw lake here, and decreases as you move farther away into a more stable peat plateau. And then finally, it's hard to see here, but this is an area that was burned in 2006, and you have a significantly higher active layer thickness in this burned region than in the unburned regions. You'll note in the GPR case, there's obviously finer resolution and spatial resolution, and that has to do with the native resolutions of the two instruments, but generally speaking, they both capture the same broad feature-specific heterogeneity. So we've established that this technique can successfully measure the active layer thickness. Looking at statistically identical matches, we have about 53% agreement between the two techniques. And then for good matches where at least one measurement lies in the uncertainty of the other, we have about 70% agreement. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the best agreement is in areas that have not been burned by wildfire. And the poorest agreement is in areas with significant burn, which kind of makes sense considering the fact that we expect wildfire to modulate the active layer dynamics. So if we now look at the long-term trends from our deformation model, this is the R variable I mentioned, what's immediately noticeable is that there's a strong spatiotemporal correlation between the long-term deformation rates and these fire scars outlined here. And what you notice is that some of the most recent fires, in this case a 2006, a 2007, and a 2002 fire, have very large secular increases in active layer, or seasonal thaw depth, I should say, whereas older fires, such as these 1971 fires, actually have a negative rate, which corresponds to that recovery phase that I alluded to previously. And so what we note is that, all right, there's a strong spatiotemporal correlation between long-term deformation and fire scars. Can we use that to tease out an empirical relationship between time since burn and the effect of wildfire on the active layer thickness itself? Before we do that, I just want to zoom in on a couple of these fires so you can get maybe a better look at them. This was the same fire that I showed previously in the InSAR GPR comparison slide. So this is the lake here that we were looking at, and then this tongue here at the southern end of the lake was the fire burn where we saw larger active layer thickness in the GPR measurements. And you note that the interannual deformation signature is pronouncedly large here over the fire, and you see that it's already begun to modulate the seasonal thaw depth of the active layer system itself. We can look at another network of fires. This one is a 2007 fire here and a 1972 fire. And what we notice is that the recent fire has a large increase in annual thaw depth, while the older fire is experiencing a gradual recovery or reduction in annual thaw depth. And then plotted at right in both cases are the uncertainties in the values, and at top here is the seasonal thaw depth. And you notice that the seasonal thaw depth in the recent fire has already begun to increase, whereas the seasonal deformation associated with the older fire is starting to resemble its surroundings and is not markedly different from them. So this maybe sheds some insight onto how long this time scale occurs. Just one last fire networks. Again, this is a 2007 and a 71 fire, and we see the same pattern of increase in the recent fire and decrease in the older fire. So with these relationships, what we can do then is we can try and construct an empirical recovery function that relates the time since burn and the severity of the interannual deformation signature. So what we've plotted here are the average interannual deformation rates within the various fire scars plotted as a time since burn. So these are the interannual deformation rates with their associated uncertainties, plotted as time since burn, and then we have basically fit a simple exponential model to this. And what we've then done is we've taken this simple exponential model and we've done a simple forward model where we say we take a column of permafrost with known active layer thickness and we essentially apply this average burn effect on the column and see how long it takes for this system to play out. And the system, in this case, is the one I mentioned previously where we have burn, we remove the system from its thermal equilibrium, we observe a gradual increase in the seasonal thaw depth, we see a point of stability and then a gradual recovery. And based on this exponential fit here, we see that this process takes approximately 65 to 75 years, depending on the long-term end behavior of the system. And the reason I say that is because we've kind of sampled these fires preferentially closer in time from time since burn. We basically don't have any old fires in this region to sample. So the long-term dynamics of this process aren't understood, and so we've kind of extrapolated a little bit. But what you note is that using this simple model here, we have a gradual increase in thaw depth of the burned permafrost for about 25 years until we reach this point of stability, and then a gradual recovery phase. And this is vaguely or broadly consistent with field observations and previous observations from other authors who have looked at fires. So just to conclude, what we have discussed is that InSAR can successfully be used to measure active layer thickness in permafrost regions. And this is particularly important in the context of geodesists, I think, because with the upcoming NISAR mission, this will give us a great opportunity for long-term monitoring of permafrost systems to see how these systems evolve with time. We've demonstrated that both InSAR and GPR and field measurements can capture local heterogeneity in active layer thickness. And finally, we've observed an interannual deformation signature that relates wildfire burns to active layer seasonal thaw depth changes. And we have, from that relationship, created a simple proxy function that tries to relate the effect of wildfire on active layer dynamics. And in this study site, what we see is that this model predicts that it takes approximately 65 to 75 years for the effects of a wildfire to have its full effect on the active layer column. And so all things being equal, essentially in identical climatic scenarios, this recovery phase of permafrost that's been burned by fire takes approximately 75 years. And so this can help us better understand the interrelationship between wildfire and active layer thickness, especially in the context of a changing climate, and can hopefully better inform our understanding of the permafrost system. So with that, I want to thank the following institutions for funding and just take any questions.
Thank you very much for this great talk. We have the time for a couple of questions.
It was a very, very cool application of InSAR, I have to say. In looking at the equations there for your deformation model, it looked like it was driven by difference in density between ice and water, right?
Yes.
And so does this model not account for, is it included in here that in the thawed zone, the water can move in and out of the column?
Yeah, so that's a great point. And so one thing we implicitly assume in this model is we're just looking at vertical change. We're not considering the fact that there's lateral movement of the water. We're just considering essentially vertical movement. And so this density differential is, and I didn't really touch on this too much, but what that is getting at is the fact that when you have ice that is thawing in the pore space, the differential density from frozen to liquid water, it will undergo a volume change essentially. And that volume change is in a sense what is causing the subsidence. As your ice essentially takes up less pore space, your whole column subsides. So that kind of captures vertical motion of water, but we kind of neglect horizontal motion, which is definitely a process. Yeah.
So it seems like in your model, you kind of return to an equilibrium state where the active layer thickness is about the same as originally, but with changing climate, is that really going to be, will you be seeing a change in that? And then related to that is 80% of fires, at least in the lower 48, are human-caused in this area. Is that really the case?
Right. So your first point is a great point. And I expect the answer is no. I expect that in the context of changing climate, this simple model we use is probably not entirely correct. The model itself may be correct, but returning to the original thermal equilibrium is probably not a safe assumption. And so the question then becomes, well, do you recover to a new stable equilibrium? Is the system unstable? And that we just don't know. We need more observations to really understand that. And to your second point, most fires actually in this area are natural. They're predominantly caused by thunder strikes in the summer. But there are some, in the more habitated areas of Alaska, there are human fires, but this is a very, very, very remote area. So it's all, thunder strikes mostly.
Yeah, in your deformation model here, to what degree can you discriminate between this DH versus phase shifts that might be introduced by variations in soil moisture content? They'd be linked, but phase shifts might impact the interpretation of the DH.
Yeah, you're totally right. And that's actually kind of the subject of work I'm currently working on, because, as you said, variations in soil moisture can essentially cause a bias in subsidence. If your area gets wetter, it's going to look like a larger subsidence than there really is. And so understanding that really is important to, essentially we've assumed that soil moisture is constant in this case, which the area is incredibly wet, so maybe it's a decent assumption, but if you want to use this technique in other areas where that assumption isn't valid, you really do have to consider the effect of soil moisture.
Thank you very much again.